Well, it's an old concept um, that you're supposed to speak the language that people understand, right? If you want to communicate with people, you have to speak the language that they understand, and that usually is referenced in the context of the oppressed versus the oppressor. And that's interpreted to mean, if not said explicitly, that the only language that the oppressor understands is violence, or else the only language they understand is money, profit, what have you. So usually when people invoke this truism, that's what they're talking about. Like saying, you can't go to a violent people in the language of peace. You can't go to a profit-driven people in the language of morality. And okay, that's logical. That's all logical and true, and I believe that. Generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with that idea. But my point is, I don't want to communicate with you. You understand? I don't want to learn your language. Why should I? I don't want to start learning your ways. I don't want to start learning your language. I don't want to start learning your approach. And if the only reason that I am learning all of that is so that I can talk to you, what's the point? I don't have to deal with you at all. If you're not learning my language to talk to me, I'm not going to learn your language to talk to you. Why should I? What's the benefit of communicating with you anyway? We just don't have to talk. You have an ugly language. You have a primitive language. And yes, I'm not just talking about language in the linguistic sense, obviously. I'm talking in terms of that truism. If the only language that you know is the language of violence, then we have nothing to talk about. If the only language that you know is the language of money, then we have nothing to talk about. If you don't speak the language of peace, if you don't speak the language of morality, if you don't speak the language of justice, well, then we're never going to be able to communicate anyway. And if I learn your language, if I learn your language of blood and greed and injustice, then I have let you degrade me. No. Why should I accommodate you to talk to you in your language when, in fact, there's nothing meaningful, there's nothing beneficial that I can get from that kind of conversation? That's refusal. And refusal is a universal language. You don't need to speak Chinese or Vietnamese or Arabic or French in order to understand what it means when someone gives you the cold shoulder. Everyone understands that. When someone ghosts you, that's a language all on its own. When someone ignores you, that's understood no matter what language you speak. You're not part of our conversations if you do not speak our language. And when we are speaking in the language of sovereignty, when we're speaking in the language of stability and peace and dignity, and you come with the language of subordination, the language of destabilization and degradation and violence, we have nothing to say to each other. And if you don't learn our language, then we never will have anything to say to each other. And I'm not going to learn your language. I'm not a
Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching me from. Now, in today's video, we're going to be seeing a video of Shahid Balsan from the Middle Nation. You might think that Western powers are so much great. Oh, they invented a lot of things. They came up with, all this language that right now I'm still using and you are using and everything. But trust me, there is so much faulty that the Western powers has caused. And one of the greatest things that I believe is that usually before any crisis happens, you understand that Black Americans will always come out and talk about it. Black Americans are so much intelligent because you see, everything in these things that they warn you about, it usually happens. And also, I like to give credits to Shahid Balsan because he is that one person that usually is the big critique when it comes to the Western powers. And he's a person that humbles Western power, all those Western civilization, and how they think that they did the greatest things. He always tries to remind them that in as much as you claim you are the authors of morality, you need to understand that you are also savages. It reminds them of that, right? And so this forms part and parcel of that part of history that we always need to talk about because so much lies has been spread towards Black people, has been spread towards these other communities. But these are the moments of the truth. And Shahid Bolton from the Middle Nation is here to break down the truth. And all of these things black people have been saying for the longest time. And all these, somehow, somewhere, this information needs to reach you. You need to understand all these concepts because it's so much important for us to learn the truth and stay within the truth, because that's one thing that they have always tried to take from us. So they know black people are great, and that's why they don't want us to, get all this information. So brothers and sisters, let's watch the video. I'll be back and then I'll be sharing my thoughts in regards to this. Let's keep watching.
A native speaker of that tongue. You understand me? And yes, if I start learning your language, I start learning your lexicon, then I'm going to start learning your idioms, your axioms, your frames of reference. And pretty soon your ways will start contaminating my ways. I might lose grasp of my native tongue. And this is all a major part of colonizing the psyche. Remember, I'm using language as an analogy here, even though it does work also literally. When you learn the colonizer's language, you start using the colonizer's language, literally their language, like English or French or what have you. Then you get comfortable in their language and you start to lose track of your native language, literally, linguistically. But metaphorically, it's the same. You learn their language and you lose your own language. You start using their frames of reference. You start using their theories, their philosophies, their interpretations, their worldview, their paradigms, their understanding. And then you forget your own. You forget your own paradigms, your own understanding. And now they've got you. And look, before anyone says, but they force themselves on us, so we have to deal with them effectively. That's why we have to learn their language. Yes, of course, I understand. But we're Muslims. We know how to deal with people who force themselves on us. We have that in our language. We don't have to learn their language in order to know how we're supposed to manage in that kind of a situation. We follow our own rules. And no, that doesn't just mean, violence or armed resistance. We have a very high language in Islam, a very complex moral and intellectual language in Islam that gives us a vast vocabulary for dealing with any issue. We have a whole repertoire of strategies for dealing with aggression, for dealing with conflict. That's revealed in the Quran, that's revealed in the Sunnah, the stories of the prophets, and 1400 years of history and jurisprudence. No, our language is vast. Our language is vast and sophisticated, intellectually, morally, culturally, politically. You have a primitive binary language. We don't. The important thing here is to recognize that they do operate in a completely different framework from us. Recognize that they do speak a different language. And understand from that this means that we are not going to communicate, period. That's a fact. And I think that's been our error. The error of many, many people across the global south. It isn't that we failed to learn the colonizer's language. It's that we mistakenly thought that they spoke our language. Understand what I'm saying? Meaning we mistakenly thought that their moral language, their ethical language, their intellectual language, we thought that was the same as ours, and it isn't. It isn't at all. And yes, you have to understand that, like I said, their language is a primitive language. I know that. I know it because I grew up speaking that language. And again, no, I'm not talking about English. We're talking about the moral language, the cultural language, the philosophical language, the paradigmatic civilizational language here. And it's a primitive language in the West. It's a simplistic language in the West. I can't emphasize enough how important this is for you to understand if you come from the global south or the Muslim world. They are handicapped in terms of their internal civilizational development because of the simplicity of their language. See, again, think about the phrase, talk to them in their language, or talk to them in the language that they understand, right? That's how it goes. Okay, first thing that means is that they do not speak your language. We focus too much on how this means that we are not speaking their language. But we need to focus on the fact that they do not speak our language. If your language is Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, the oneness of God, and our servitude and our accountability to Allah, while their language is power is God, and power means the ability to force others to do whatever you want, well, we can't communicate in those languages. Those are two completely different languages. There's not even a way to translate the difference in these languages. You know, let me be clear here also that the West does not speak the civilizational language that they print on their brochures. You know, rights, freedom, liberty, reason, and so forth. These are marketing slogans. So don't think that that's their civilizational language. No, that's packaging. And you won't understand that unless you are looking at them from the vantage point of your own pure epistemology. You have to look at them from where you are and see what you see and call what you're seeing according to your own definitions. Because if you let them tell you what they're doing, then you're never going to be able to make it add up. Because what they're doing and what they say they're doing are two completely different things. If you listen to them, it's going to be like wearing noise-canceling headphones while listening to like an audio book of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life while your family is screaming and getting slaughtered downstairs. And you won't be able to hear them because you hear Jordan Peterson telling you about how great the West is. I'm telling you, you need to pay attention to what's really going on with Western so-called civilization. Not what they tell you, not what they say, not what they say to gaslight you about what they're doing. You already know this in your gut. I mean, you've seen them burn villages to save villages in Vietnam. You've seen them sanction children to defend human rights. You've seen them bankrupt whole countries, whole populations to protect free trade. See, they always attach noble slogans to their savagery. And if you accept their epistemology, then you're going to be basically accepting to inflict upon yourself cognitive dissonance. No, you have to look at them from your own vantage point, and you have to define their actions by your own terms and determine for yourself what they truly believe by your own objective observations from that vantage point. Their civilizational language is might makes right. And then they repaint or they redefine what right is by telling you that right is whatever might just did. That redefining and that repainting is what the so-called Western civilization calls its values. Please understand me. That's what they think values are, just packaging. That's what they think values are. So look at the contrast these two civilizational languages. The Tawhidic grammar of Islam, which whether or not Muslims live up to it, the grammar of Islam binds power to justice under divine audit. But you can contrast that with the predator grammar of the modern West, which binds morality to power only for presentation purposes. It's like putting a heart emoji on the side of a missile. Okay? When Western officials speak, you're usually hearing one of three layers. Layer one is the myth, you know, the sacred words that are recited for legitimacy, universal rights, rule of law, democracy, you know, rational progress, reason, liberty, so on and so on and so on. Then level two is the interface, which is the language that's used to satisfy the elite and to write policy papers, to secure markets for capital. That's going to be about governance, reform, transparency, inclusion, development, and so on. And then you get down to layer three, that's the real operative language, the real program code, the moral language that actually allocates pain and profit, victimization and exploitation, extract, enclose, securitize, neutralize resistance, institutionalize impunity, might makes right. Okay, the first two layers are just soundproofing around the third layer, you understand? The first two layers are only there to obscure the third layer, which is their real language. They cushion their viciousness with virtue. That's what those other two layers are about. Islam doesn't work that way. And I'm not being idealistic about this. Now, I'm not saying that Muslims are perfect. Sin and hypocrisy exists among Muslims just like it does anyone else, sure. But the grammar does not authorize that. The Quran gives no quarter to sin and to hypocrisy, and it defines what it is. And the Sunnah of Rasulullah ﷺ hones that definition further. The law codifies it, and the hereafter punishes it. In Islam, the program language is the moral code. That's the only layer we have. Obedience, justice, mercy, accountability, protection of life, intellect, lineage, property, and faith. We fail often, but failure is breach, not design. In the Western order, breach is not failure. Breach is design. See, the Muslims, we did not build a moral and ethical language, a civilizational language. We didn't build that around us. We built ourselves around the the moral and ethical and civilizational language that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed and that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam embodied. Do you understand? We did not create the code created us. That's why we're Muslims in the first place, and that's why we're Muslims first. Not Arab, not African, not Asian, not American, not European, not so-called black and not so-called white. We are Muslims. Our nation is the Ummah, the middle nation. Okay, that's a moral citizenship. It's a belief-based nationalism, a belief-based identity. We don't get to sprinkle glitter on filth and call it diamonds. We have to be real. We have to be real, or we risk losing our citizenship. We risk having our passport revoked. That is our means by which we enter Jannah. We lose our whole sense of identity when we don't take Islam seriously. It's not packaging for us. But that predator moral grammar, that's different. The Western so-called civilization, their code is cruelty. That's their program code, not the user-friendly operating system that you see. Their first rule in language is to convert every relationship into an extractive interface. You know, land becomes an asset. Water becomes, a futures contract. All human attention becomes a source for ad revenue. Identity is nothing but something to use for branded advocacy merchandise. The second rule is to monetize any sort of asymmetry. If I control finance, law, and tech, it doesn't matter what you have, because you need me to let you even access what you have. They convert their own their dependency on the resources that others have into those people's dependency on them until they thank you for extracting their wealth. And then they always wrap extraction in moral language, you know, human rights audits that are bundled with privatization, democracy promotion that's supplied via regime change, you know, humanitarian corridors that always track pipelines. And then you always try to offload risk. This is also their language. Environmental collapse, labor injury, currency crises, always push the liabilities down to the periphery, down the chain to the periphery, to the poor and to the unborn. And then it's part of their language to always make sure that they have an architecture for impunity. If you're in the core, then your crimes are accomplishments. But if you're in the periphery, even accusations will earn you sanctions and conviction. Adaptive hypocrisy is part of their language. Contradiction doesn't wound their reputation. It's a strategic asset for them. Today's principle is whatever validates yesterday's actions, yesterday's atrocity, yesterday's pillage. But Islam starts from the opposite pole. Power is a trust. Wealth is custodial. The creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nature, is not a set of asset classes. It's a set of ayat, signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that will indict you if you exploit them unjustly. Every human being is both an abd and a khalifa, a slave and a steward. Your wealth carries embedded claims from the poor. Even your business contracts can be worshipped if they honor justice, and they will be sinful if they cheat. There's no lobbies on Yawm al-Qiyamah. This grammar ties every domain, governance, trade, family, environment, all back to a single axis. Did you keep trust with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and with His creation? Or did you transgress the boundaries and commit dhulm? Notice, in the Islamic language, the language of Islam, a human being's failure triggers repentance and repair because the standard is external to power. But in the predator grammar, power rewrites the standard so that failure never even registers. They rewrite what is moral according to what they're capable of doing. When the West talks about rights, they mean marketable license, unevenly enforced. Rights are protected when they secure investor mobility and suspended if they obstruct extraction in any way. Just ask any sanctioned country about their right to food and their right to medicine. When they talk about freedom, the only freedom that they are serious about is deregulation of capital. When they talk about democracy, it means the status quo of tyranny by the unelected rich. It's just packaging for regime change in every other part of the world. If our governments block foreign acquisition, then our people deserve democracy. If our government greenlights your extractive deal, then it means that our governments are stable. And when the West talks about reason, what they mean is the exclusion of morality from judgment. Rule of law, so-called, descends with full force upon the weak on behalf of the strong. If you're weak, they prosecute. If you're rich, they negotiate. Settlements above, sentences below. Look, these aren't bad words in and of themselves. They're captured words. We don't reject the concepts. We reject any claim that you actually believe in those concepts or practice those concepts. You only use those concepts for camouflage. So for anyone in the global South, the next time any Western envoy comes to you talking about wanting to have a partnership or make a deal, there's 5 silent tests that you should run in your head. Is there symmetry in enforceability? In other words, can they be held to the same terms that they impose upon you? And if not, it's unfair and it's a myth. It's a setup. Then ask yourself, who absorbs the downside risk? The pollution, for example, the default inflation that might happen. If it's only on you, it's a setup. Then ask yourself, can you withdraw without financial asphyxiation, without sanctions, without covert destabilization? If not, it's a setup. Ask yourself, are you free to publicly criticize the deal without being throttled, without reputational assassination? If not, this is a setup. Ask yourself, would they accept to have the identical terms, the identical logic used on them? If not, this is a setup. See, the only reason to learn their language is so that you know what they're really saying, so that you can understand what they're saying. You can learn their language, but never use their language. You can't use their language without degrading yourself, because again, it's a primitive moral language. So you have to be ruthlessly bilingual. You understand? Be fluent in their interface, but rooted in your own epistemology, so that you can accurately identify what their real code is, what the code is that they're actually following underneath the pretty interface. Translate outward, but anchor inward. And if you're going to use their terms, their concepts, every time you use one of their, glamour words, you need to bind that to a non-fungible Islamic definition and a measured test. Don't say freedom unless you add freedom from debt slavery, freedom from data harvesting without consent, freedom from wage coercion, freedom from compulsory complicity in oppression. You understand? Don't say development unless you add childcare, fair labor, actual metrics of human well-being, community food security, Gaza supplied, not besieged. If they refuse the test, then you have exposed the packaging. Before you enter into any arrangement with the West, trade, security, media licensing, whatever, run a quick RPI-style audit. Who holds the decision authority in this relationship, in this agreement, in this partnership? Who controls the critical inputs? Who can retaliate without cost? How adaptable are we if we pull the plug on this agreement? What dependencies are we locking ourselves into? Map your positives, map your exposures, and if the spread is too wide, then no amount of strategic partnership language is going to save you. You're negotiating surrender terms, not partnership terms. This is a concern when we're talking about the GCC, for example, partnering with BlackRock and with a national OCGFC for establishing a new Middle East, for establishing the vision for the new Middle East. I've said all along that there are risks involved in this because these people are predators. The a national OCGFC are predators. And right now, particularly in, of course, Gaza and also in Syria, I think that we're seeing a battle going on between the military-industrial complex aligned nationalistic OCGFC, which supports Zionism. We're seeing a battle now between them and the allied faction of the a-national OCGFC and the GCC and BRICS, a battle for controlling outcomes in the region. And the danger is because the a-national OCGFC is not as invested as BRICS and the GCC in the vision for the region. They have contingency options for how to continue profiting from destruction. They all agree that stability is best, that that's the optimal outcome, but the military-industrial complex, the neocons, the nationalistic, Zionist, OCGFC, they're not going down without a fight. But in my opinion, in my estimation, BRICS and the GCC are in a stronger position in terms of the relative power index vis-a-vis the a-national OCGFC and vis-a-vis the nationalistic OCGFC. So don't learn their language in order to communicate with them in their language. Learn their language to expose that their real moral language employs deception and camouflage all the time. The West cannot function without narrative legitimacy. Its machine requires constant laundering, narrative laundering. So withdraw your consent for their narrative. Attach conditional access. The exchange has to be on our terms. You know, if you want access to our capital, well, we want accountability for you. Then you have to either negotiate on real terms or escalate nakedly, burning the whole narrative. And that's what's happening now. And remember, Islam does not need to imitate Western hypocrisy in order to win. No, our comparative advantage is that our declared grammar and our moral machine code are meant to be the same thing. When we fail, we repent. When they fail, they just rebrand. That's a structural vulnerability for them, so exploit that. Stop debating their brochure, their pretend language. Speak to the engine. Anchor in Tawheed. Audit power. Weaponize truth. Repossess captured words. Refuse relationships that hide slavery in the fine print. The middle nation, the Ummah, is not going to outspin empire, but we will out-truth empire. We will out-trust empire. We will outlast empire by aligning our speech with the reality that all power answers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Predators rule by darkness, but a stewardship rules by the light. So flip the switch and watch the cockroaches scatter.
So, we need to have what is called critical awareness. And this critical awareness comes from historical exposure to deception which is embedded in institutions. Understand that from slavery, justified as civilization, to segregation framed as order, to mass incarceration presented as public safety, Black Americans have repeatedly experienced Western systems failing to match their stated moral values. And over time, this produces a population that is less susceptible to surface level messaging and symbolic gestures. Understand that when freedom, equality, and merit are promised but structurally denied, skepticism becomes a survival skill. So what appears as resistance to confusion is often the result of generation of forced political literacy, because one of the things that these Western powers focus on is confusion. They bang so much into confusion. They want you to get confused, and once you are confused, that's when they know how they control everything. Black Americans are people who are really intelligent, and I'll give them that, because they cannot be confused by the Western powers. They are always at the forefront, warning Africans, warning Latinos, warning all these other groups, so that they don't make mistakes that the Western powers, especially in the United States, wants them to make. They are in the forefront critique of power, and they share the historical experience which shape perception rather than a claim of innate superiority. Understand that Black Americans have lived a sharp edge of Western modernity, democracy, capitalism, law, religion, media, name it all. Now, while simultaneously being excluded from their full benefits, this position has produced a form of double consciousness, where Black Americans are compelled to understand both the ideals the West proclaims and contradiction it practices. Rather than being passively shaped by Western narratives, many Black communities have learned to read them critically, identifying the gap between rhetoric and reality. And that's just important, as you need to know. One thing that makes frustration. Why frustration emerges when dominant narratives lose persuasive power. Understand that Western societies have long relied on the assumption that their worldview is universally convincing and morally authoritative. When Black Americans reject simplified explanations such as blaming individual failure instead of structural inequality, you understand that this disrupts the legitimacy of that worldview. Frustration arises not because Black people are unintelligent, but because they refuse to internalize explanation that absolve systems of responsibility. So this refusal undermines the comfort of those who benefit from the system or who need to believe it is fundamentally fair. So there's also a cultural dimension to this tension. Black Americans have produced independent intellectual traditions through churches, music, scholarship, oral history, and political organizing that exist parallel to and sometimes in position to mainstream Western thought. Understand that these traditions emphasizes lived experience, collective memory, and moral accountability. When Western institutions attempt to redefine reality through media cycles or policy language, these counter traditions often provide alternative interpretations. What frustrates some white observers is their inability to monopolize meaning or control the narrative, right? So, another source of frustration lies in expectation of assimilation. So, historically, integration was often imagined as acceptance of Western norms without challenge or without challenge. However, Black Americans have frequently engaged Western society not as passive recipients but as critics and reformers. They have demanded that Western ideas be applied consistently and honestly. This insistence exposes hypocrisy and forces uncomfortable questions about power, about history, and accountability. Frustration arises when critique is mistaken for ingratitude or defiance rather than civic engagement. And what's most important is that this dynamic lies in expectation. This dynamic is not about individual white people versus individual Black people, but about systems encountering informed resistance. Systems function best when the assumptions go unquestioned, when a population understands how narratives are constructed. Our population understands how blame is shifted, how consent is manufactured, how inequality is normalized. It becomes harder to govern through illusion alone. The frustration, then, is structural. A system designed to confuse and pacify meets a community trained by history to interrogate and remember. So ultimately, what is being labeled as, American being too intelligent, it's really true because they stand as the gatekeepers of Africans, Latinos, Asians, who have fell in problems of of white supremacy. They help them with information. They give them direction and help them maneuver all these problems that they face in the United States and generally across the world. So brothers and sisters, please let me know what you think and feel about this video. Until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.